Hello, this is FRGH Racing, and I'm about to discuss with you this chassis normalization. This will be a particularly long video. I could break it down, but essentially what I'm going to do now is just tell you kind of the table of contents of the video. So first we're going to start with some of the history behind what brought us to this point that plays into the balancing that will come next. The next thing will be how these balance system works between what we have now and what chassis normalization would mean. The next thing would be a proposal between essentially an LMHX system and a single or a two class system. And then how I'm going to close it up is kind of essentially try to settle into pretty much all those little problems that people bring up. These concepts have been talked about for it's going on years, and it's been pretty, people come back and ask the same questions. It either gets left behind, people forget, and it's understandable because, we've had tons of community members come together on this. The master plan, we put together a Google thing. We got quite a few members coming together. We talked about all the problems you could possibly have, and essentially we went through every one of those. So now onto the video. I hope you enjoy this, and so let's get right into it. So the history, some nostalgia for you. We had tiers. We had 10 tiers and then TX. And essentially what we had going on is that you would have T0, and then the next one you would unlock is T1. Now the thing about this is it had a class system to it, and it had the chassis normalization. And this was way back. It was changed. Yes, there was a point when we did have the volumetric kind of balancing, but we're not going to get into that. Essentially, we did have this before, and the thing about it was these classes or tiers were, what they're called. They're tiers. One was better than the other. You would unlock the next thing. You would progress. You would pay for it. You would buy them, and you would buy each shape. And essentially, you would just work your way up, and you can mix and match. You could over tier, under tier, all these different things. And essentially, it created a very convoluted system by the end of it. And that's why why Mark or Sergi or whatever, that's why they essentially did away with it. Because you had to balance the energy system, and then they had the guns that, they have a set fire rate, and then we didn't have an energy system at one point. All the guns kind of worked the same regardless of what tier you're in. And then you had RR, robot ranking part points or whatever, and we went through so many iterations of balancing that we're going to try to stick to the actual how the tiers and the chassis parts work. So essentially what ended up is that we got the TX cubes, and that means that the T10 and the TX were balanced with each other. The TX cubes were the top of the line, really light, and a little more CPU investment. I actually have another classic video or classic picture. Yeah, this is, look at that. Look at the old armor values and stuff. But anyway, they definitely snuck up over time. This never existed. That'd be really cool if it did. But yeah, we had this TX cube and the T10, and you would essentially buy each shape. And that's, the big thing was that this was 3 CPU and this was 1. And essentially, having 3 CPU invested for a little more armor and way less weight, actually a fifth of it, you ended up with really cool compact builds. One of them called the Thundercloud, and it was super fun. And essentially, it kind of introduced the concept of having more classes that were intertwined with each other. But that was shortly before that whole thing was ripped away. So now I'm going to move on to the next segment. Mark this in the table of contents, I guess. So then, now I'm going to talk about what we have now. We have a volumetric system that, if you look at it, this is comparing everything below it to the base cube. And what I would say to keep in your mind is that when you look at a base cube value, and I talk about a class, everything's going to be based on the base cube or the full cube, and then everything is like a fraction of that. And it makes for like really easy calculations and such. So if you look at the volume, you know, an edge slope, for example, you would say that that's exactly half of an edge. And if you look at the mass, it's exactly half. And essentially this is consistent for everything. I mean, there's some of them that are a little off, but I mean, that's just getting nitpicky at that point. So that's where our current balancing comes from, is like mass versus volume. And then we have an HP curve, which essentially is kind of like a custom curve that FJ has kind of been readjusting here or there over time. I think we've finally settled into something that works, but the point is that this is limited to, if you added a class, it would become a big balancing problem. So now we'll move on to the next kind of phase, the proposition. So if you were to mix this armor system with a class system, I'll show you, we have essentially a big problem here. If I could zoom in. There we go. So if you were to look at this, your H cubes and your M cubes, you know, they would all have their own balancing curve. And yeah, they, you know, they could work, they could all use the same curve, but the problem is you would like multiply the complexity of balancing just armor cubes by like a factor of how many classes you have. You would look at your mass values and you would realize, oh man, my corner slopes, if I use volumetric balancing, would be completely ridiculous. They're like 1/10 of a kilogram. Likewise, you would have conflicting parts like you would have back in the old tier days, where like if you had a here you go, you had a like an edge or something like a inner round, and then you compare that to a corner slope that's an M cube. It's like, what's going on? One of these is 2 CPU, one of these is 1 CPU. They have a different mass value, and you're like all mixed up on what you want to use, and like it just becomes a headache to balance as well. So yes, it adds way more depth, but the problem is you have a compounding class system with an already LMHX system, I guess, per se, which is what the FJ has kind of inevitably created. So let's see if I can get out of here. All right, so on to the next concept is what I call CPU resolution. So what we would have to do to get all these different classes is that you would essentially have to double the CPU. And I have that right here. If we have 2000 CPU now, the use would have 4000. That means all the components would, CPUs would be doubled, your movement parts, guns, everything. And like your standard cube, your M cube per se, would have a 2 value as well. But what this allows is for classes to be like 1 CPU, whereas if they're in our current CPU range, you would have half a CPU or a quarter of a CPU, or you know, it could get however in depth you want. But the point is, if they want these essentially fractional classes to be opened up, you can't do that because FJ kind of like doesn't like fractions. So simply you just either double everything, multiply something by 10, It's just some kind of multiplier. But what that multiplier also does is it increases the resolution of which you can balance parts over. So what that means is, like, let's look at a hover. So we have something here is 28 CPU and a Tempest, which is like 26 CPU, and the difference of that is 2. And if we were to double it, you would have 52 and 56. So now you have a difference of 4 as opposed to 2. It's doubled as well. And that means I can now balance them between each other over 4 CPU as opposed to just 2 CPU. So instead of 26.5, I could use 53, a nice clean number, and I just kind of tweaked it just a bit. And I mean, that could be done for all these parts, guns, like particularly the low level ones that are no good. So I mean, yeah, that's what we have here, and we'll kind of move on to the next concept. So if we look at this balancing curve, you can I'll post a link to the charts, but essentially your M cube's your basic, like that's your go-to. Your armor's a little bit lighter than it is now, and then that's the makeup for the fact that you don't have to mix, like, not everyone's gonna want to cube spam full cubes, which is what you're gonna have. You're gonna have everything of one weight. It's going to look like this. All your parts are gonna have the same mass. This is just for redundancy, just so you can see that all shapes are equivalent in stats, weight, and armor, or aka chassis normalization means that you would have all those same stats, but you wouldn't have they wouldn't change the way they work. Like, you can still Triforce with a inner corner slope, or you could still use a corner or an edge. All those weaves that we are inherently actually buffed in a way. So you can use like your 3 and your 4 connection point Triforcing methods and have it just as strong as a full cube for that class. And if I wanted to utilize the lightweight or low CPU, or alternatively a really high CPU armor dense cube like a TX, I could have that choice. So that's what these numbers kind of come together as. I mean, as old as these numbers are, they hold up pretty good still. And if you look at stat comparison, we have your L, we have your H, you have your M, you have your HX, and your TX. So just because the spar is longer doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's like my armor per CPU, however, my mass per CPU, they're both increased. And it's whatever's more important to you, or what's a trade-off that you're willing to have. So that's what we got going on there. And then there were some questions about how the inventory will work, and I actually put together a little example here. So how buying cubes would work now is you would buy it by class. You would, you could have different rarity levels. Of course, I mean, uncommon, the most common ones, the white, could be whatever these are, but that doesn't matter. Point is, you could split up these classes by rarity, and then you would only buy the class as a whole. Then you would go into your cubes, just building cubes. This would be like everything else, like arrow rods and struts and stuff, or helium. Point is, you would just say, oh, I want an edge. I put that one down. I now have 199. I pick a pyramid, put that down, I have 198. Point is, I am only taking a cube from how many I have of that class. So that's eliminates the need to buy, like, there's like 12 components, I believe, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 5, 5, and 2. So there's 12 shapes. They could add more, and then you have like 3 to 5 classes, or however many they choose to add, and then I mean, at the end of the day, you would have to be like buying 100 and something different parts just to have all your selection back. Whereas this, you would just buy the overall class. So if I wanted 1,000 M cubes, you would just hit this would pop out, and then you would select away. So I feel like that mitigates the problem with the inventory. You would have an easier time purchasing things. That also would take away from the issue with, like, if we did use the current system volumetrically compounded with this, you wouldn't have to have a different cost, or yet again, it simplifies it. You don't have to look at the tooltips for all these. It would just all be nested in one class. The next thing is the gun. If we look at, let's see, just a good example. You know, it could work just like the paint gun. However, a really good example to kind of, so you can see what's going on, is like, let's imagine these colors as now a class. So I think a really good game that shows this off and how it could work is Machinecraft. So you can see it, how it would look now. It's pretty normal, but then you go into paint mode, which is what we have in a way. It's a little more basic in this game, of course, but I would pick a color and I would paint it, and then that would be what it looks like. But then let's say I had an LMHX gun. I would hit, in this case, group, but look what happened. It goes into a completely different view. Still the same cubes, but like your groups would now be per LMHX. Now, here's the thing that he did a pretty good job doing. This is made by one person, this game, the developer. If you say pick a different group and I right clicked, it picks that whole body and makes it that group, and without conflicting with things that are separated by like a joint. Now that's getting a little more complex, but I think FJ could probably do something similar. So that would be the LMHX gun. It would make for deploying your class systems a little bit better. And if you look back into the game, it would be like you would pick your class, and then if you were to look at like this, you would see the number on the side of how many of that class you would have. So you would have like 12 of, you know, this class, or then you would, you know, go over to here and it would have like 20 or something, or 100. And you would just assign a class and it would give back to the whatever class it was, and then take from the inventory of classes that you want to use. So there's that. And then my last thing is the closing statement. So the thing with this is that if they just give us like 2 classes or 1 class, they just like don't even give us TX, then we lose like essentially 12 different options for building. And that would like really suck. If we had 3 classes, it's a little bit sweeter. But I think my 5 class system would work. That's something that's been talked about amongst a pretty good group. It's been proposed to like some of the players from very competitive clans. So I've kind of got the green light from that. But it just, it would take a little bit of tweaking once it's actually out there. And then the more classes you have, the more depth you get back. But you could also, the nice thing is that this chassis normalization also allows you to, build it how it looks like. This whole plane, for example, wouldn't have to be freaking heavy just because I'm using like mostly full cubes and rounds. I could assign a completely different class and call it a day. I could do like what they do with the paint gun, where I just, fill up the whole thing, and there you go, you're done. So point is, all these little things I proposed could be done, but if you don't choose to do it as a directed towards FJ, then we lose a whole ton of depth, and it'd be like no fun at all. But what it allows is a super awesome platform to pretty much drag and drop, and then like you could think up a new class. It could be like, oh man, a 10 CPU mega class. It's like awesome. Maybe these classes are cubes that are made up of like, you know, like a pack of 4. You know, imagine all that kind of stuff. Like imagine a cube that was this big, that was like 10 CPU and had like 5,000 armor. I mean, you set the platform to have all these options that could make the game amazing. But right now we're just limited to what we have, where, you know, if you want a really competitive robot, you have to make like a sloped mess, and it really just like your cosmetic choice goes out the window. If you want to be competitive, you then start building with really light options. I mean, if we look at some of these frames, I think I've cut them away, but you know, a lot of these use they don't use full cubes for that reason, or something like this. I think someone else made this, and essentially I modified it. But right here, you know, it looks like a normal cube. You open it up and it's a whole bunch of like slopes and edges and rods and stuff. Let's see if I can get a better view. But yeah, no longer do you have a cosmetic choice. You have to like build something to fit like this mold that we have. So the classes opens up those options, allows you to still build cosmetically, and essentially I think it's the superior choice. So I hope this is clarified and, you know, got some of your questions out, and if there's any more, feel free to ask. We probably have an answer for you in one way or another. And yeah, I hope this makes it happen.